What's up, everybody? Now that they've laid the Woka Popa to rest, I thought we'd talk about some of the men that have filled that position in the past. I talk about the Church of Rome and their influence in world history quite a bit, and I'm sure some people have no idea why I talk about them so much. So, we'll cover some of the leaders of this organization in the past, and I don't think we'll even get into the Crusades, which was nothing more than papal mercenaries that G-sided anybody who thought slightly different than them. But it goes to show if you convince people that this is God's will, they will commit some of the worst atrocities in history. But let me put this into perspective. When a former president of the US passes, you get a handful of world dignitaries that show up. This was Bush Sr.'s funeral. You got Prince Charles, Angela Merkel, and of course, a whole litany of oil rich Abdullahs. No surprise there. They pretty much owe all of their wealth to Papa Bush after the liberating Operation Desert Storm. But what is that? 6 or 7 dignitaries showed up? But now, when the Popa passes, you have dignitaries from 130 countries show up. And I think that's a pretty good analogy of the balance of power. The so-called leader of the free world, the US president, has about 350 million people. The Popa has a billion, most of whom have been taught since birth that he is the regent of God on earth, and anything he says has to be true because, well, he said it, so it's true. And this is one of 2 organizations that classifies themselves as a religion with followers residing in every country on earth, whose first loyalty is to that organization and not to their country. And just so you know, the founding fathers of America fought really hard to keep this organization out of our government. Separation of church and state, they've got us convinced that that means you can't pray in the classroom. No, the whole purpose of separation of church and state was to keep this church out of our state, because their ancestors had seen firsthand how all this went down over in Europe, and they fled over to America to start something new. So, a quick disclaimer before we get into this. Look, I understand that out of a billion, there's 999.99 million people that just go to this church to worship Jesus. Good, more power to you. But anytime you consolidate that much power, somebody's going to abuse it. So, I'm not saying anything bad about Catholics in general, just like I don't blame all Americans for the actions of people in Washington. But some of the people at the top rungs of this organization are far from what I would call holy. Case in point, let's start off with Benedict IX, whose birth name was Theophylactus. See if you can say it out loud without laughing. I don't want to go too far off in timeline matters, but he was bishop and ruler of the Papal States from 1032 to 1048. But for you guys that know my general timeline of things, I would say that that was probably about the same as 3 to 500 AD, right around that era. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. So today we're used to popes serving for life, but historically speaking, it hasn't always worked out that way. In the case of the 11th century Pope Benedict IX, for example, he was pope 3 times. He also was a poisoner. He held orgies at the Lateran Palace, which a lot of them did, and may have actually been a, quote, demon from hell. This is the current Lateran Palace rebuilt in the 1500s. And I kind of want to put things in context here. When we hear, 10th century, 11th century, we're movie trained to think a bunch of dumb peasants. But in reality, the original Lateran Palace was probably just as opulent as this. So while we see old paintings of peasants tending the fields, yeah, that was part of it, but the families that people like Theophylactus comes from lived in beautiful, sprawling estates that today look like this. You take away internet, television, electricity, and running water most likely, and you still have this. So I know a lot of channels try to act like anything before the 1900s was the Stone Age, but we're talking about people that were ruling over cities like this. Instead of everybody having cars, they had boats and ships. So you can really think of this time more like Hollywood portrays 17th century high society France with Game of Thrones type rulers. So paintings from this period may look like this, but in reality, this is the exact same landscape and living conditions as 1,000 years ago. Their pool wasn't quite so blue, probably. So, Benedict IX was born into a powerful and wealthy Italian family, the Counts of Tusculum, and he was the nephew of two previous popes, Benedict the VIII and John the XIX. According to one scholar, Benedict's father, Alberic III, wanted his son to be Popa, so he made papal clothes to fit the boy and had him consecrated in 1032 when Benedict was only 12 years old. As for how to get a 12-year-old elected Popa, wholesale bribery. Imagine the young pope as the tween pope, and you've got a good idea of Benedict IX's pontificate. Now, he was in no way qualified for the position, but he had been raised in a rich aristocratic family that had controlled the papacy for decades, so he knew how to use his office to enjoy himself. Benedict spent money on prostitutes and played with magic books. He invited other men and animals to his orgies, and his enemies swore that they had witnessed the young Popa consorting with demons at night. Now, you can search the term Popa and demon, and this is the most famous painting, but there's a lot of these out here, and this isn't even Benedict IX. This is St. Augustine in the 1400s. Here's another one, but this is Sylvester II from around 1000 AD. So Benedict IX would have just been a few popas after this. And he was probably related to Sylvester II, who was said to have been able to communicate with the devil and compel the demonic being to do certain tasks, such as foretelling the future. It is also written of him that when Gerbert, Sylvester's name before he became Popa, was master of a school, he had a conference with the devil and inquired of him what his future career was to be. He immediately received the following ambiguous answer. Translated from R, you still will be R, and as Popa shall be R. The prophecy was deemed to be accurate, for Sylvester held 3 R titles during his life: Archbishop of Reims, Archbishop of Ravenna, and Popa of Rome. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you have others with monikers like the Satanist priest, Urban Grandier, and people like Boniface VIII, who they say worshiped the Dark One. And it seems like you have more people wearing a gown associated with demons than you would if you went down to your local bar. I guess there's a couple ways you can look at this. They were superstitious medieval peasants with overactive imaginations, as they would lead you to believe. Or you can look at it like, well, there really are demons, and think about this from their point of view. If you're trying to corrupt the world, then why go pick off the little guy out on the street? You're going to be going after the biggest, most influential people around, right? Now let's take this to the next level with things that I've talked about on here quite a bit. One could also say that the demons are trying to seduce the followers of Christ. This is the Church of Rome, after all, which should make the head of the church one of Jesus's most loyal disciples, right? One would think. But now let's say my theory about Yahweh and the OT is 100% correct, and that Yahweh is not the Father that Jesus spoke of, and not the creator of the universe. And what if these holy fathers at the top understood that 100%? Look at Solomon's temple. It was supposedly built by demons, right? Solomon and all of his wealth, all of his wisdom, his harem of 1,000 brides was basically all brought about by demons. Just that checkerboard floor. Well, that's not only in Brotherhood temples, it's also a feature of Catholic churches. So I would almost be willing to bet that the people that slapped the OT on front of the story of Jesus knew exactly who they were worshiping, and it had nothing to do with the Father of Jesus. It had to do with those spirits that can bring about wealth and power and the fulfillment of all your worldly desires. If you go through the OT, all of these promises that Yahweh makes to his followers are Faustian bargains, aka a deal with the devil. It never goes through the way people want it to. Hey, follow me and I'll take you to the promised land. He didn't mention that the promised land is already full of people. And they're giants. We looked like grasshoppers in their eyes. It took 2 men to carry a bunch of grapes back to the camp. And really, if you look at this story from a neutral perspective, it looks like the Canaanites were the blessed people. Not only were they giants compared to normal humans, but their fruits and vegetables were giants too. And evidently, they had been minding their own business, living peacefully next to the Egyptians until the Hebes went and attacked them unprovoked. I mean, if God showed up and he said, here, I'm going to give you a Ferrari, and he leads you over there and says, there's your Ferrari, and there's somebody sitting in the driver's seat, are you still going to take the Ferrari? And then when you say, hey, somebody else already owns that, then this God character strikes 5 of your friends with the plague and says, no, if you don't, off the driver of that Ferrari, his whole family, all of his pets, all of his livestock, then I'm going to strike you down on the spot. At what point do you start questioning who this God is? Because that's exactly how Exodus went down. So this video has gone a completely different direction than I planned on, but we're here. So did the top people in Church of Rome understand this about the OT and understand that they're not worshiping the creator of the universe, the father of Jesus? They're worshiping some lesser entity that can grant them wealth and power and prestige. I mean, if Yahweh sends demons to help King Solomon build the holiest temple of all time, then should it be any surprise that he sends demons to guide his church? Not really. It seems to be on par. Speaking of the holiest temple of all times, which we portray like this all the time, oh, blessed be thou. At the dedication of this temple, they slaughtered 22,000 cattle and 120 sheep. So if you really think about that scene, there's nothing holy about it. This is as close as I could get AI to portraying that. Just imagine them all in pieces and just imagine the smell. Honestly, I think anyone living in a first world country today would be horrified at this scene. So it may not be a fluke that some of these popas were consorting with demons. They were just the ones that got caught. You know, the Protestants used to consider the popa in the Church of Rome the Antichrist. They may have understood that the church was subverted long ago when they slapped the OT right on top of things. And then when you get people that aren't part of the club that truly worship Jesus, then this happens. There are several accounts of the clergy who, one of them literally fought with demons at night. Like he would be beat up in the morning. People in the next room over would hear yelling and furniture breaking and just an all-out brawl going at night. So it could be that part of the church was in league with the demons, and when a truly pious man came in, then the demons would attack him at night. Okay, so back to Benedict IX. I just went off on a whole video tangent, and I couldn't even get through the first popa without getting into all the strange demonic relationships that these popas have. But this is a depiction of young Benedict IX with a vulture next to him. But you can just imagine giving this kid ultimate authority as he's going through puberty and him boning everything that moves, no matter what sex or even species. And it's no surprise that the citizens of Rome began plotting to assassinate him. Benedict IX's enemies hated him from the beginning. He was young, unqualified, and the son of a wealthy family, not exactly papal material if you care at all about the hallowed solemnity of the position, which I really don't think many people did, especially when you go through all of them. I think people of the city were just content if they weren't a psychopath. But he was, so they decided to red rum him. On a feast day, the would-be assassins snuck into St. Peter's Basilica, each carrying a length of rope. Swords would have been too obvious. But a sudden eclipse ruined the plan. Quote, about the 6th hour of the day, there occurred an eclipse of the sun, which lasted until the 8th hour. All faces were as pale as death. The eclipse startled the assassins, giving Benedict IX time to flee the basilica. Now, think about that in terms of, let's say Benedict IX really was in league with demons. Well, what are demons good at? Influencing people. So let's say they had a deal with Benedict to protect him, and they knew that these assassins were wanting to take him out. Then the demons influence them to go at this particular time. They get in there and an eclipse happens, and it freaks them out. They think it's a sign from God that they're not supposed to do this. So I can actually see that scene playing out that way, but I might just be crazy. Benedict's bad reputation continued to grow. Pope Victor III later wrote that Benedict IX had, quote, a life as a pope so vile, so foul, so execrable that I shudder to think of it. Finally, in 1045, a mob of Romans attacked Benedict IX, forcing him to flee from Rome. With Benedict IX on the run, a new Popa appeared on the scene, supported by Benedict's enemies, Sylvester III. Sylvester II being the one that talked with the devil all the time. And this whole scene plays out like an unholy soap opera. However, after 7 weeks of chaos, Benedict IX refused to give up the papacy and marched into the city, kicking out Sylvester III to reclaim his title. Now, they just say that he marched into Rome, but he marched in with his entire army and went up against Sylvester III's entire army. And you might as well just make the gowns red with that much blood in the streets. So Benedict IX had only been back in Rome for 6 weeks when he decided that he'd had enough of the papacy, but he figured he might as well profit from this office one last time. He sold the papacy to his godfather, John Gratian, for a princely sum of 1,500 pounds of gold, nearly 30 million in today's money. But by this time, the church was so broke that plunderers seized church lands, and the public roads and highways throughout all Italy were thronged with so many robbers that no pilgrims could pass in safety unless strongly guarded. These big, huge cathedrals were really the Disneyland of the day. People would come from all around and make pilgrimage there and then come in and spend a lot of money. There's actually a lot of instances where people sold positions in the church. It's called simony, but I think this was the only time that the pontificate itself was sold. In the Inferno, Dante placed simony lower than heresy, adultery, and red rummer, arguing that simony was a more serious sin. To Dante, simony was spiritual prostitution. One scholar concluded of Benedict, quote, "He was a bandit, not a priest, stained with adulteries, homicides, and the vices of his bringing up and his youth." By 1045, Benedict was probably only in his 20s when he decided he needed a third term as Popa, in spite of the fact that Gregory VI and Sylvester III were both still alive, and both claimed to be Popa. So all three battled each other for control of Rome. Each had supporters in the church, but no one had enough for a decisive claim, and no one was strong enough to seize control of the city and the church. The citizens of Rome revolted. A group rode to the German king to ask him to get rid of all three of them to, quote, cleanse the sty that was Rome. That German king was Henry III. In 1046, he arrived near Rome and demanded that all three of them appear so that he could judge them. Instead of showing up, Benedict IX hid in his family's castle. So Henry III arrested Sylvester III and had him exiled to a monastery. Gregory VI stepped down, admitting his, quote, shameful and simoniacal heresy, which was the work of the devil. And with Benedict IX in hiding, the king appointed a new German Popa. That Popa lasted 8 months until he died of poisoning. The main suspect, Benedict IX, who somehow became Popa for a third time. But his enemies were finally fed up with him. After 8 more months in St. Peter's Basilica, Benedict IX fled from Rome, and Henry III sent imperial troops to kick him out. According to rumors, Benedict IX spent his last years in a monastery where he repented. Sure he did. Even the Catholic Encyclopedia says that Benedict IX was a man of very different character than his predecessors and was a disgrace to the chair of Peter. So that's just the story of one of these holy fathers, and not even necessarily the worst, not even close, really. There were many rich, powerful families that controlled that position for generations. And the ones that we have stories about are just the ones that were arrogant enough to do it in public instead of keeping all their creepiness private. But like I said in my 10-minute tangent there, it seems like a lot of these were in league with evil spirits. They knew it. And that was the whole point for them, to gain wealth, power, and worldly things. And for the demons, what better way of perverting the message that Jesus brought than corrupting the very church that is supposed to carry that message to new people? I don't know. Makes sense to me. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll catch you on the next one. Static out.